For this next project, I've created an exact copy of the console client, and I've called it GUI client because we're going to be using that in order to make the changes from here on in to have a .NET desktop GUI client. So to refactor a little bit, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class library application, and I'm going to move the common functionality over to that application. So I won't replace one with the other. I'm going to have a console client and a GUI client that both use the same base of classes. So in this library project, the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this default class that they give me. And the next thing I'm going to do is start moving over the house and light classes. Those are going to be encapsulated for these purposes here within the library. So it's quicker for me to just create a class called light and copy the text over because I don't want to have to worry about updating the namespace and everything else. So please just bear with me on this. It's a bit quicker for me. So I've created this light class, and I'm going to delete it from the console client, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the house class. I'm going to create house. And then I'm going to copy the text over from house in the console to house in the library. And once I've done that, I'm going to delete the one that was in the console class. Or excuse me, I should say console project. So with that gone, I am now going to add a reference from the console client project to the library project because without that it wouldn't build. And once that's in place, I'm going to actually do a build, which I don't expect to work, and I'm going to do what's called leaning on the compiler to see where things are erroring out, and that'll let me get quicker to where I need to be to go take care of something. And the thing I'm going to need to take care of is to add a reference into this actual file for house, and I do that through a shortcut. And now everything should build, and we should be all ready to kind of start importing this functionality into the library as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at all these methods I have in here that aren't related to console, and I'm going to pop all of them out and put them into a class that I call light service in the library. So let me grab all of these and cut them. And I'm not going to lie, I actually designed this in such a way so that it would be easy to do. That's why there are separate functions for printing all of the lights to the console and the single light. So I'm going to add a class to the library, and I'm going to call it light service. And then I'm going to go and paste these methods inside of this class, because now the console is actually going to use these inside of the library instead of using them inline. What I'm going to need to do now, because all of this functionality has the REST-sharp library references inside of it, I'm going to need to manage this, and instead of the console client using it, I'm going to have library actually use REST-sharp now. The console client has no references left to this stuff. So I'm going to use the same shortcut here to say that I want to use REST-sharp, and that's going to get rid of some of these compiler errors, and then I'll get rid of the rest here by actually taking this variable out and putting it in at the class level. So once I go over here, this is going to put REST client inside of this class, so we would expect this now to work. And inside of program.cs, I'm going to go and I'm going to create an instance of this light service here. Say new light service right as the constructor gets started. And then that is going to get rid of all these problems we're having here where the compiler doesn't know where to find these methods. So we're going to tell it, go ahead and find these in the light service. And oops, I do need to make all of these methods public in order for this to be able to see them. So that's why you're still seeing the red squigglies. Let me go and make all of those public. And then once that's in place, I should have more luck over here in the program class itself. So I'm going to ignore the squigglies for now, and if there's still a problem, once I build, it'll explain to me what it is. So I'm just going to go through here and add the service specifier to the beginning of each of these method calls, and then I'm going to try a build and see if it works. So let's see what happens here. And if I do a build, I see that I have an error. Oh, I have a using that is no longer accurate because I took REST-sharp out of this class. So let me try that again. And oh, I see. So there was still one remaining problem here. While I did make these public, what I need to go and do is actually make them not static anymore. These are instance methods because that's how we're using them. So let me go take the static modifier off of all of these methods, and then we should expect this to build successfully. And we should be able to pretty soon run the GUI client and see what's going on. So let's see, that does in fact build, and we should be all set for the next step, which is to add in the GUI client. So I'm going to add a WPF application, and there's going to be a fair amount of copying and pasting as I add in snippets here too. It isn't my intention, it's well beyond the scope of this course to teach anybody WPF, but it is a simple way to get a .NET desktop GUI client up and running, so that's what I'm going to use. Once this loads, the first thing I'm going to do is define some auxiliary classes in order to help me in my efforts here. The first thing I'm going to define is something called a command, and this is going to encapsulate what happens on a button click, which I'll show you momentarily. So let me add in a reference, and then I'll add this command class, because the command class is going to make use of library anyway. So I'm going to add in a class, and I'm going to call it light command. And I'm going to paste some code in here and explain a little bit about what this is doing. So light command is going to be invoked whenever a button is clicked. And light command is a WPF construct. There are going to be some predefined things in here. This eventing, and let me add in the using statement for light service. So execute is really what we're interested in, service.set light state. The rest of this is kind of WPF boilerplate, and I need to implement this interface. So with that in place, I'm now going to define something called a view model. The view model is going to expose the commands. So let me call this light view model, and I'm going to paste some code in here for this too. The view model will expose the commands, and it will also expose the light business objects for consumption by the GUI. So there's our commands turn on and off, and there's the light so that the GUI can get information about the light. And finally the light service, because we're going to be passing that into the commands as needed. And let me make a couple of corrections here. Now that should build. And the next thing I'm going to do is go into the main window's code behind, which is the code that drives the main window. And I'm going to show that piece of code how to consume this view model. So in order to do that, I am going to expose from this window, which the GUI is going to be bound to, a collection of lights. So observable collection is a WPF specific thing, and I'm also going to have an instance of this light service, include the usings for those, and then I'm going to wire some things up in the constructor. First, I'm going to set a local variable equal to the result of getting the lights from the house object. So with the lights in place, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new observable collection to set the lights property equal to. And from the lights collection I have, I'm going to use each of those to define a new view model, and I'm going to pass in the service, and then I'm also going to pass in the light itself. So now I have an observable collection of these view models, and I'm going to specify that this Windows data context is itself, so that's what lets us bind to the collection of lights. And then I should be all set and able to build, and I expect that to work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set GUI client to be the startup project so that when I build and run, it launches this GUI window. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. And you'll remember that last time out, we had left only that basement light that was just kind of a dummy thing we weren't especially interested in. And, oh, actually, before I do that, let me paste in the actual GUI code itself. That is an important detail. So this is just going to be some more WPF kind of boilerplate. It's going to be a collection that shows you all the lights that we get back from the service. So now let me actually run and show you what's going on. So I'm going to hit F5 and run this application. And it's going to pop up a little window here that shows me I would expect only the basement light. So here it comes, and let's see what we've got in this window once it loads. And yep, there's basement. It's got buttons on and off. This is not an especially pretty user interface, but it could always be improved upon. So what I'm going to need to do now is go back into the shell and use the console version of this. See, I'm still in the GUI client folder, but now it's building the console project as well as the GUI one. So that's going to be kind of the administrative project here. I'm going to switch into the appropriate directory, and then into bin and debug. And now I'm going to execute this console client as I did before in order to add the Office Desk light. So with that added, now what I'm going to do is relaunch the GUI, and we'll see if that light does in fact appear, and we would expect it to do exactly that. So let me launch GUI client once again, and hopefully we'll see two lights. And there we have two lights. So let's pull the presenter onto the screen to get a look at our light once again and see if we can kind of execute the coup de grace here, which is turning the light on and off from an actual GUI. So let's turn it on, and success. And then let's turn it back off again. And voila.